my reasoning behind putting them on here was I think moving on from Gerard Mayo was the right call. I think, VFL, but I mean, to be honest, it's kind of crazy. He was like the coach in waiting anyway. Like that entire
Yeah, it
situation
was
just
weird.
felt range. Um, but I like the variable hiring.
Loved it.
I from a Titans perspective, what he did here, he was the classic like our roster was terrible at the end and we won more than we should have. And to be honest, we were always better than what the roster really was. Um, he had the issues and whatnot towards the end, but one thing that I have to give him credit for is that it definitely seemed like he did not want to trade AJ Brown. That night in the war room, it seemed like he was not very happy with that. And I think that was kind of the undoing of everything. That's pretty much when everything fell apart. But he has a track record of overperforming for what the roster is, and I think the Patriots need that. And then to your point, they had holes that they needed to fill, and they were also an interesting team that um, had a ton of money as well. And sometimes you have to overpay when your roster is terrible. And
It's
I
very
did
true.
not love the contracts that Landry and Milton Williams got. Landry's a bit overrated from an edge rushing perspective. He's a bit more, he's a guy that gets to clean up. For he benefits from the pressure internal a lot, and his win rate's not super high, but you needed a body there. Same thing with Milton Williams. You went and you had a guy you wanted to go get, and you went and got him. So they add that, and then I liked adding Carlton Davis and Spillane at linebacker, and then Stephon is an interesting signing.
It is.
Locker room wise, very intriguing, but I am a big fan of getting a guy that's a veteran wide receiver in the room for a young quarterback. You need a receiver who's been in the league a minute that can be dependable and reliable. And I know he's coming off of the injury, but I think he could be kind of a security blanket for Drake May. So I love the offseason moves they did there.
I did too, man. I loved a lot what the Patriots did. Obviously, I have them at number 2 on my list, but starting with the Vrabel hire, like you were talking about, he's always kind of coached his talent up, like his especially his defensive talent at Tennessee. Like they had
Yeah.
a good roster on the offense, but defensively it was just kind of a bunch of guys, and they always kind of played above the talent they had. And I'll move on to the Landry signing because I agree Landry was an overpay, and he's not productive in their like pressures or anything like that. He's really not a great edge rusher, specifically pass rusher. But it is interesting to me that he's paired with Mike Vrabel again because he was
Yeah.
decently productive under Vrabel when Vrabel was at Tennessee. So that is kind of interesting. And then Diggs, I agree with you, man. There wasn't a lot of options on the free agent market for receiver.
No.
He was one of the few options. Like it was basically, are you going to trade for T. Higgins, or are you going to bring in a guy like Stephon Diggs or Chris Godwin, which Godwin never
Yeah,
even
if they
hit the
could have gotten him.
market? Exactly.
Exactly.
Godwin never even hit the market because the Bucks re-signed him. So there really wasn't a lot of options. And that kind of moves me into my other point why I kind of gave them a pass. They had to overpay for these players, like you said, Dakota. They had all that cap space, so it's really like it's an overpay. But since they had the money, it really didn't matter for the Patriots. And really, there was not a lot of people wanting to go to New England, and there really
No.
wasn't. Players in general don't like playing in the cold. Like they just don't. That's one factor. And the Patriots still have a lot of question marks. Now they do have a great rookie quarterback, which I think they're doing right by him in this offseason. They shored up the offensive line. They did what they could at offensive line, bringing in Morgan Moses to plug a right tackle need, and of course drafting Will Campbell. But for me, the reason they're number 2 is because I think they probably had the best draft in the NFL. I think overall, if I was ranking draft classes, which we didn't do, we have draft reviews up on the channel if you want to go check out like the individual team draft reviews. But the Patriots, to me, if I ranked draft classes, probably what would be number 1, man. They got so many valuable players in the late rounds, like Braden Swinson in the 5th round. I think he'll end up being an extremely productive player for them. They did a lot of good work on the defensive line, like you said. Like we just talked about the Cowboys and Adiguzua versus Milton Williams. It is a bit of an overpay for Milton Williams, but again, it's a team that really needed that interior defensive line help, and you kind of had to if you're the Patriots. So, I mean, dude, I think overall, with what they had to work with, which I mean, listen, they had a ton to work with, a lot of cap space, some draft capital, high draft pick, but I think they did it. They managed it pretty well overall.
Absolutely. Real quick shout out. We got a few people watching, so feel free to shoot a comment. We'll try to touch on anything anybody sends in the chat. Um, yeah, I completely agree. And yeah, from a draft perspective, we touched on it in depth, in those videos. But you know, Campbell and Jared Wilson could be starters on the offense. Campbell is, but Wilson could also be a starter on their offensive line. Adding Kyle Williams and Travion,
Exactly.
weapons for Drake May. And then Braden Swinson along with Joshua Farmer on the defensive line. I love that. And then one other thing I'll give them credit for is say what you will about, Josh McDaniels as a head coach, bringing him back as an offensive coordinator who has
been good.
He got head coaching jobs twice because of that.
Exactly,
He's
man.
now back. So he's gotten head coaching jobs because he's done a good job as an offensive coordinator there. So I think that was a solid hire by Vrabel and not hiring a Todd Downing or somebody from the Titans days.
Yeah. I think that's a really good shout, man. I wasn't even considering that, but I agree with you. Like, I think when McDaniels isn't the head guy, like he isn't calling the shots, he's much better. Because he's a good offensive mind, and it's going to be interesting for Drake May's development, who was really good with quite literally the worst supporting cast in the NFL last season. So it's going to be better. Like they've added
Literally
weapons.
has to be.
It has to be. It can't get worse. That's how bad the Patriots, surrounding cast was for Drake May last year. So it's going to be very interesting to see his development in year 2.
And that's a good point because they had the 3rd overall pick, but I think most would agree they were the worst team in the NFL last year from a coaching perspective, from a roster perspective. It was just not good. And Drake May looked really good on a roster that was pretty bad. So add some pieces around that young quarterback. I will say for Patriots fans, I don't think you're competing for a Super Bowl in 2025, but you are laying the foundation for 2026 to be a huge year for this team. So love what they did to help build that.